On behalf of the Vera List Center and Parsons, the New School for Design, I'd like to welcome you to another event in the series of Confounding Expectations, Photography in Context, brought to us and brought to you through the Aperture Foundation. This evening tonight is dedicated to Framing the Presidency, and we're delighted and honored to have with us two photographers, Tim Davis and Todd Heisler. We have the New York Times campaign photo editor, who is David Scull. And the moderator for tonight is Robert Hariman, the Chair of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. The panel is very timely for many reasons, one of which is that Parsons has currently an exhibition on democracy. It's open for another few weeks. On Saturday, the New School presents a conference on picturing politics, the influence and the role of cartoons and illustrations in political debates. And just today, many of you, I imagine, have picked up two different versions of the New York Times about the presidency. I'd like to thank at the New School my colleagues, Pam Tillis, Director of Public Programs, for helping organize this event, and of course also George Pitts, the Chair of Photography at Parsons. And I would like to extend a particular thank you to the Aperture Foundation and Laura Patak, the Educations Program Manager, who is now going to introduce the speakers. And thank you for coming, and thank you all for being here.
Hi, thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm very excited to introduce our four panelists. Before I do that, I just wanted to quickly mention that Aperture wants to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, an anonymous donor, the ASMP Foundation, and the Milton and Sally Avery Arts Foundation Incorporated for their generous sponsorship of Aperture's educational programming, making tonight's panel discussion possible. And I also wanted to let you know that just outside the auditorium, Aperture has a table set up, and we're selling both subscriptions to Aperture magazine and one of our panelists, Tim Davis's book, for a discounted price tonight only of $25. So I invite you to stop by the table after the panel to take a look at that. And now I'm honored to introduce our four panelists. Our moderator for this evening will be Robert Hariman. He is a professor of rhetoric and public culture and chair of the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. His books include Political Style, The Artistry of Power, and No Caption Needed, Iconic Photographs, Public Culture, and Liberal Democracy, which was co-authored with John Lewis Lucchese. Hariman's scholarship focuses on the relationships between art and argument in political culture. Recent essays include a co-authored large study of political styles, a theoretical essay on parody and democracy, and several critical studies of photojournalism. He also maintains a blog called No Caption Needed, where he and his co-author frequently post on photojournalism and public culture. During the 2008 fall term, Hariman is in residence at the Institute of Advanced Study in the University of Durham in the UK. His article, Framing the Presidency, which is in the current issue of Aperture magazine, was actually the springboard for tonight's event. The article traces the evolution of campaign photography from 1900 to the present. And he'll be adapting this article as the basis for his panel presentation tonight and acting as our moderator. Tim Davis is an artist and poet living in Tivoli, New York, and teaching photography at both Bard College and Yale University. He is the author of 4 books of photographs, including My Life in Politics, Illuminations, Permanent Collection, and Lots. And he is also the author of 2 books of poems, American Whatever and Dailies. His work is in the collections of the Guggenheim Metropolitan Whitney Hirshhorn Walker, and many other public institutions, and he has had solo exhibitions in New York, London, Los Angeles, Zurich, Brussels, Geneva, Atlanta, and Miami. Tonight, Tim will show his work, as well as talk about his brief experience following the Obama campaign from the perspective of a fine art photographer. And we also have David Scull with us this evening, who is the politics picture editor at the New York Times, where he has directed election photo coverage for the past year. He has worked as a staff photographer at the White House during the last 2 years of the Clinton administration and the first month of the current Bush administration. Following that, he covered Washington, D.C. as a freelance photographer for Newsweek, Time, U.S. News and World Report, The New York Times, and others. In 2004, David worked as a staff photographer for John Edwards during his vice presidential run. Tonight, he'll be sharing his perspective on the process of assigning and editing and overall shaping the coverage of the candidates and telling the story of the presidential race. And we also have Todd Heisler, who is a staff photographer for The New York Times, who's been part of their team of photographers covering the 2008 campaign for more than a year now. In 2006, he received the Pulitzer Prize while working for the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, where he was employed for 5 years. He's also received honors from the World Press Photo and the Visa d'Or at Visa pour l'Image in Perpignan, France. Before that, he worked for a number of small publications near Chicago, where he grew up. And tonight, David and Todd will be co-presenting and kind of talking a little bit in conversation about what it's like to, the relationship between a photo editor and a photojournalist. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Robert.
As you can see, these are very tough acts to follow, which is why I'm very pleased I'm going first. And I'm a little mystified as to why I'm here, but I assume it's because of the book, No Caption Needed, and the blog by the same label. And the basic idea in that project is that a democracy depends not only upon governmental institutions like the Congress, and not only on political processes like the electoral campaign, but also upon a distinctive public culture. And that culture is woven and rewoven continually by public arts such as photojournalism. I think photojournalism is a vital resource that we use in order to make sense of our world, and not least our political world. Now, to get a sense of how that might work, let's look at a picture. This is a brilliant photograph by Gary Winogrand at the 1960 Democratic Convention. To understand why it's so important, you also have to see how it's a bad photograph. The figure in the center of the frame, in fact, has his back to us. Our attention is distracted from the central figure by his grainy image on the television screen in the foreground. Even that screen is interrupted by a bar that is in the way. And in fact, if you look, you can see a bottle beside it, and on each side of Kennedy, the microphone and a gavel, and then in the rear of the photo, the tripods and large cameras of the media as they are creating the spectacle. And you begin to get a sense that the president is encased in a large technological apparatus that threatens to replace him with his image. And in fact, that is a profound anxiety of democracy in the media age. In fact, there's a fundamental predicament there. We see the political leader, but he has his back to us. When we see him face to face, he's on the boob tube. And let's take a look at that tube, right? There's a television that has, as it were, insinuated itself into the photographic frame. It's that relationship between media that I want to emphasize tonight. And the argument I'm going to make is that some of the time, perhaps only rarely, but some of the time, photojournalism draws on other arts, typically dominant arts in the culture at the time, in order to frame what it sees, particularly the presidency, and these aesthetic differences can have political consequences. Now, if you look at this, I've mapped out several periods. The dates are very rough, and it's important that you not see them as successive, but additive. In other words, as time passes, the photographer has a larger repertoire to draw upon. We have more choices to make as to how we see things. And candidates have more ways in order to be persuasive or to mess up. So if we look at this before 1900, you can see that painting and portraiture in particular were the most authoritative pictorial arts. And as we're going to see, painting or photography followed suit. And as you go down the line, platform oratory, cinema, television, advertising, and now digital media were dominant influences within the culture at large that sometimes are evident within the photographic frame. Now also note, I'm not claiming contagion, just as I'm not claiming that we see here a process of decline. I don't think the media are destroying politics. I don't think visual media in particular are corrosive. Nonetheless, we can see change, and with that, different influences upon the process by which we form political judgments. And so very briefly, before 1900, you can see that photography very neatly could imitate painting, and for good reason. The photographic process was very cumbersome. And just to give you a sense that the dates are fuzzy here, this is from 1913, but again, you see very much the same image. And so when the oil portrait is in fact the authoritative template, then photographs can look very much like that. But with changes in transportation, the expansion of the electorate, the populist movement, a number of other forces, platform oratory gained a renaissance. And the photographers with lighter cameras were able to keep up and bring that back to the rest of the nation. And here you see Teddy Roosevelt on the stump. And again here, you very quickly notice that public oratory is not a cool medium. It's very much a performance art. He does not have a microphone. The body has to be at full cry, engorged, arms up, letting it rip. Also, look around him. You'll notice there's a social tableau behind him of the civic elite. Notice the reporters down below writing down his words because his words matter. And I love this picture. Here he is standing on a table. Again, you can see the social tableau, but you have here the image of the president as an eloquent orator. His words, like Roosevelt himself, are elevated and yet still accessible. And so this remains to this day very much an ideal to which we wish our presidents would suffice. But you can get on the wrong side of the template. Here you have Wendell Willkie, and he looks somewhat deranged. The platform is now a moving car. He's moving past the crowds too quickly to really engage with them, and you get a sense that, in fact, platform oratory is on its way out as well. And sure enough, we move to our next period. The cinema is now the dominant art, and with that, the cinema idol. And sure enough, there was a president who knew how to strike a pose. Again, I think you can see the similarity. FDR, though stricken with polio, was a master at striking the distinctive pose. Look at how the cigarette holder there is at one with the facial mask. He is grinning, though not laughing. He's not saying a word, yet he definitely is communicating. This is the president as leading man. Again, you can use the template less successfully. Here's Thomas Dewey trying to strike a distinctive gesture, not doing so well, in fact, not as well as Bogart playing Dewey in a movie in 1944. Okay, but time marches on. Now we get to television. President Kennedy was a very savvy use of the new medium, and in fact, political success stories often are stories of candidates being very savvy users of new media. And television was distinctive in that for the first time, the visual medium was seen in the home. And so if you saw someone in their home while you were sitting in your home, you had a powerful basis for direct identification, and Kennedy figured that out very quickly. The White House is both official and familial, and we had the famous photo essay and many, many, many other images of Kennedy with his family. This, as you know, became essentially iconic. This is a poster of the same. But look how he looks like the fathers in the TV sitcoms of the time. Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, and so forth. He's wearing a tie yet at home. He's amused by, but not really bothered by the distractions around him. He's perfectly willing to let the children steal the show. However, you can, again, get on the wrong side of the template. This is George McGovern a bit later. One thing that happened is we started to get lots of pictures of candidates at home or in hotel rooms with their families or their surrogate families, that is to say their staff. But here you have McGovern. I'm sorry for the poor reproduction. It's from a photocopy. But he is looking as if he is seriously depressed in the dark-hued room, looking at the grainy image of the other candidate and the incumbent on the television screen in front of what looks like a test pattern. This is not a good choice for the presidency of either a talking head or a depressive. Perhaps someone tried to help him a bit. Here's another shot. He's supposedly being masterfully in command here, but my God. Okay, the undershirt, the body hair, the sagging flesh, he looks like a third-tier mob boss. You do not want the national father to look like dad on his day off. Okay? And sure enough, this guy never made that mistake. With Ronald Reagan, you had someone who could be a leading man, and this, I think, is a perfect example of fusing two templates at once. But the advertising image really took on a life of its own. Note he's not dressed as the president here. No one expects him to look like that in the Oval Office, and you know that. What is distinctive about the advertising image is that it gives you a brand, one that is always the same, that is recognizable everywhere. This shot was actually taken in 1976, but it was used in 1980 and became part of the Reagan brand. And of course, the key thing is it's not Reagan at all, it's the Marlboro Man. And I forgot to put that in the slideshow, but I don't think it matters. We all know what the Marlboro Man looks like, and there are shots where he looks just like that. To show the trace, this is from the most recent Republican convention. That's the Texas delegation. Okay, and again, I love this shot taken by Ben Sklar down in Texas. Now, you can bend this a couple of ways, right? So you can take it into advertising, except there weren't a lot of black Marlboro men. But what if we took it back to the cinema? And sure enough, someone did. And I think that's a good example of how this blending of the media occurs on both sides of the camera. But it gets even worse. Okay. If at one end of the advertising spectrum you have the icon, at the other end you have the car salesman on late night TV. Guess where Dukakis ended up? This shot was taken at a General Dynamics plant in Michigan. Is a typical campaign shot. Presidents are always going to factories and other facilities, and yet there he is, his head encased in that helmet. He's dwarfed by the tank. What's supposed to be a decisive gesture, in fact, looks puny. He looks like he's trying to sell you that tank. This image was so damaging, the Bush campaign used it in their advertising. Now, currently, we have all of these resources drawn, and we are in a new period in which the digital media are becoming the dominant media. This photograph is a nice reprise of the Winogrand. Here you have the equipment ever more present, dominant. The candidate has completely disappeared. Now the only real bodies are those of the media staffers, and there the image remains in the middle, but quite dwarfed. It would suggest that Winograd's prophecy was true. However, it's more complicated than that. I want to very quickly run through a number of variations here. This is from 2000. There the image has in fact replaced the candidate, but at his own choosing. He wasn't present at the debate in person, so he sent his image in instead. But this is really an old media shot. You have the obviously very familiar TV screen. You have the candidate trying to use that medium rather than be manipulated by it, and he's doing it through a major network provider, CNN. This is the world we live in 2008. It's a world in which there are a million cameras everywhere, being used by everyone from every angle all the time, and of course anything can be uploaded and put onto the web and then into your inbox immediately. It's also a world in which we have a plethora of screens. Not just the few TVs in the department store window, but screens everywhere. And in fact, of all sizes, okay, and in all places, and in all manner of seemingly erratic relationships with the candidate himself. There you have Hillary virtually and McCain in person. There you have Hillary both in person and virtually, and so forth and so on. Now, the question is, what are the aesthetic principles of the new media age, and how are they evident in photojournalistic framing of the presidency? Let me just suggest a number of things. One is we're starting to see a lot of backstage shots, and I think that might be an attempt to restore the sense of the real candidate. And so we have quite a few of these, as if there were only one camera there, right? As if there were still one place where we could have a relatively unmediated or controlled experience. This was so prominent, the Obama campaign then brought it into their own display, the top images from their webpage, and they offered supporters an opportunity to win a chance to be backstage with Obama on election night. At the Huffington Post this week, there's a slideshow backstage with the Obamas on election night. Here they're blended together. We have both the image and the backstage scene. Another thing we see is the candidate is continually fragmented. I have another project called Boots and Hands, and I've got thousands of images of hands and feet, disembodied, of candidates and lots of other people as well. And there are many such images of all the candidates throughout the campaign. Why, I'm not sure, but we are continually being exposed to these body parts, these fragments of our political leaders. Here, both the effect and the cause are brought together. You have the fragmented body and the media that produce it, but particularly the image on the right, you see his head is down in the screen, his feet are are outside of the screen, and you have a disembodied candidate. Here's another image catching the way in which our optical technologies are refracting our political leadership in very odd ways. This I find quite poignant. Another principle, I think, of the digital age is the distribution of the candidate across the society. He's no longer in one place, but all over the place. And here you see the debaters are actually up on stage, but of course the screens are all over. Here's a lovely reprise of the Winograd shot, except the moderator now has her back to us and her face before us on a screen. Here's another case of the distribution of the candidate. I love this image. It contrasts the screen with, on the one hand, the thick political culture of the 19th century and the pictorial medium that's appropriate to that, and also with the gnomic audience in front of it. The candidates are simultaneously miniaturized and magnified, and these images capture both at once. You have a speaker who is then dwarfed by the image, and the one on the right, if you look down in the lower left, you'll see Laura Bush walking, the actual Laura Bush, in front of this gigantic image of the president. Okay? And finally, we have a number of images which show a contestation between the actual candidate and his or her image. And there are a number of these, as you can see, as if we recognize that they're both there at once now, that you neither get one or the other. It's not a question of one displacing the other quite so much as the fact that somehow you have to deal with both of them. And I particularly love this image. It looks like we do have a contestation, a choice to be made. Do we go with the image or do we go with the actual candidate? The hand reaches out and says, go with the candidate until you notice it's holding a camera. And I find this particularly poignant. Again, the civic leader has been replaced by the image, and so we wonder just who is really there. And yet it goes on. This is a recent use of the Winograd image in an article in the Times on charisma. There's also, I think, a trace of it in that Time cover. And now, in fact, we understand charisma is not breaking away from, but actually successfully working through the media. And so we've come full circle. Photography has its own institutions, conventions, but it is not an autonomous art. No art is. It also occasionally draws upon other visual arts. In particular now, I think in the digital age, it's going to be up not just to the photographers, but all of us to try to make sense of the new reality in which politics will of necessity thrive. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tim Davis. I also don't really know why I'm here. But one thing I think I've gotten out of that last presentation, which was fascinating, is the essential idea that photographers are, and in some sense, working against their subjects. What I see in those pictures, all the recent pictures especially, but especially from Winogrand's perspective on, is a kind of sense of, I have to find my own way of looking at this thing. And the reality is, when you're in these situations, it's incredibly difficult. Just as it's hard to kind of, throughout this whole campaign, I always found myself listening to, I mean, it's all anyone's talked about for the last year, 6 months. And I always thought, as I listened to what every opinion everyone said, was, where did you get that from? You know, where did that come from? And it's incredibly difficult in those environments to find something to say. And the Winogrand picture is so poignant because so many of those pictures, which are kind of like wry little ironies or subtle tweaks of the system or something the photographer is trying to say in this incredibly mediated environment, are just things that Winogrand has said perfectly so long ago. Now, as someone that isn't at all a journalist and whose work, I've never had to have my work answer to anybody else really, except for myself. I've often felt that this is my main imperative, though, that I'm kind of working against dominant kind of paradigms, and especially in the beginning of my work, it had to do with architecture. I photographed in an office, in a hospital, parking lots, and different places that helped, you realize that architecture is a form of human control, sort of there to control what you see and how you feel and how you move through the world. And I always felt like I was working against it to try to find something more meaningful. This was from a body of work that I tried to photograph in big box stores, only I would get thrown out. All the work you're going to see here is made with a large format view camera, so it's a kind of 19th century camera on a tripod with plate film and a sheet over your head. And it's important to understand and also very difficult to explain or translate in a digital presentation because it doesn't look any different. But it's a kind of photography that requires a different kind of thoroughness. Every picture you take nowadays costs $25 or $30 or whatever just to make one. And so the equipment is cumbersome. At any rate, you notice when you go to big box stores that nobody will help you for half an hour. Well, I was able to photograph for half an hour before people would throw me out. And one day I was in this, you see a super Kmart back there in the background. I got kicked out, I went for a walk, and I saw this house that was kind of lit up by the store's lights. I took that picture. And across the street, there was another house that had the reflection in the window of a Shell oil sign, and I took a picture of it. And that led to a body of work. That was my first real kind of engagement with politics and photography called Retail. And they're all pictures of houses that have signs reflected in their windows. So they're made from a very particular vantage point where you can only see this. It's very fleeting. If you move 1 inch to the left or the right, the thing is kind of gone. And my relationship with politics became complicated, and I realized that it was complicated in looking at these pictures. When I first printed them, I noticed I hate this thing. You know, I hate the imposition of the global corporate world on our private lives. I hate the inescapability of it, that this was obviously a metaphor for, on one hand, and also quite literal. I love this thing. It's so beautiful. They're like stained glass windows, or like the illuminated capitals in medieval manuscripts. So that very ambivalent relationship toward what I'm trying to say about this stuff is something that persisted through another body of work that I'm going to run through very quickly, called My Life in Politics. I made this work after having spent a whole year photographing in New York City, trying to kind of photograph New York in a way that was very contrary to its image in the years I had lived there since 1990, a sort of yuppified, prettified New York, and I was photographing junk and rubble. And then when 9/11 happened, all the work changed and seemed very prescient and very poignant in a way that I didn't want it to be. So I cast around for things to do, and one day I took this photograph. It's of my grandmother's collection of lefty political pins, and it sits on a wall that my grandfather painted. And then I was in LA, and I made this photograph, again, with the view camera, large format camera. I'm pushing it around in LA in a tripod outside of a abortion clinic. And I made this picture. And I kind of knew that I had a project, and it was called My Life in Politics. And so what I did was a kind of two-pronged thing where I visited self-definedly, political places. This is in a communist summer camp. And when I was in those places, I felt that I could do essentially what Winogrand is doing there, find my own little angle on it, my own way to understand the way politics revealed itself in this place, a place that was self-definedly political, but I was looking at it not the way they necessarily wanted to. So this is a video of a mock protest. The camp divides up into 4 groups every year. This year it was the Hollywood 10, the Afghan Women's League, I forget what they were, and then they play ultimate frisbee against each other, but they also stage protests and things like that. So this was a video. And then I also drove around the country and kind of watched places where politics just kind of popped up. This is on 8th Street. There was supposed to be a John Kerry rally. It was a John Kerry rally, but he didn't show up. And these girls had gone off to go to the ATM machine. One thing that I kind of realized was that we don't live in a very political country. For all of the anxiety that we've all felt for the last few months, we live in an incredibly apolitical place. A place where politics is something for most of us that occurs on television every 4 years and does not occur in our daily lives. We don't belong to unions. We don't belong to fraternal organizations. We're not in politics. And having lived in Europe for the last year, it's different. Local politics, people know about what's going on. People are involved. So it was kind of interesting to try to find the ways politics erupted into the landscape, and it took a long time, and it wasn't necessarily easy. My model for it was Walker Evans. Now, Evans, who was hired by the FSA, Farm Security Administration, with lots of other artists and photographers. Is this going to happen under Obama too? Am I going to be able to get a job documenting the lay of the land? And he quit. It was not the strictures, who was Roy Stryker, who was the head of the FSA, would literally go through the pictures he didn't like and put a punch hole in them to ruin the negatives. And Evans was much too expansive an artist to be constricted by this tendency. And, he ended up making this fantastic book called American Photographs. And the politics in these pictures is as much sort of in between them as it is in them. And they're very wide and expansive and show a kind of great bandwidth of attention. And so I kind of decided to follow the same tack. This is in a thrift shop. This is in the Massachusetts State House. This is in a t-shirt shop in LA. I call this 7 Entertainers. One of the things I think is very telling about it is that Buffy the Vampire Slayer is sort of rubbing elbows with Jack Kennedy, and she's really his type. And Xena the Warrior Princess is rubbing elbows with Bill Clinton, and she's really his type. The big hair, dark, big, strong, just like his mom. This is called Combatant Balls. This is the Madonna of the right. This is the Madonna of the left. The same woman, just slightly different, like a butterfly flapped its wings on one side of the planet, and she ended up at a Veterans Day rally at a military base, and she ended up at a pro-Palestinian march. It's not far from here. And it is hard to explain that how using the view camera is in a sense a different kind of interface than anything that we were looking at before. It's slow, it's cumbersome, and it requires a kind of, I don't want to, thoughtfulness is pretentious, but a kind of like, a kind of different cognitive space. This is a replica of the Oval Office in the Carter Center. So that's actually a photograph of the view from the White House that's turning kind of cyan. The way that Chinese restaurant menu displays turn cyan. This picture and this picture were made at within an hour of each other in the same place. This is in the, these are two lobbyists in the Georgia State House. There's like the Coke lobbyist and the Pepsi lobbyist. And this picture was outside. This woman was trying hysterically to get in there to propose, to talk about, she had never been political before, but she was very worried about the electronic voting booth situation, and so she was trying to write with her highlighter pen to try to write her notes that she was going to give a speech in there. So there's a kind of, wide swath of the country that I'm looking for. I did a whole mini project on the crotches of the Founding Fathers. It's George Washington, for those of you who are into him. This is in St. Louis. This is what I just sort of think of as a perfect metaphor for the United States. It's a distorted, blood-red image of itself used to cover over a failed business venture. This one I don't really need to explain. So, in a sense, I think that what's really happening here is the same thing you're seeing in these pictures, which is a kind of effort to work against political systems, to work against the intentions of a place like this. This is the Connecticut Senate. There's a filibuster in session. There's a guy off camera talking. Everyone else is out smoking, talking on their BlackBerries. This is a anti-flag burning rally in Albany. Only the media has turned up for this one. Of course, that's all that matters. These guys have just found out that their friend died in Iraq and they're drunk, stopping traffic. This guy is claiming that the revolution will not be televised, despite all of his efforts to televise it. He's also spelled televised wrong. And there's our screens, but this is very 2004 because it's in the store. All right, very quickly. I've made this series of pictures of audiences with a view camera every time I give a talk. I thought this was going to be at Aperture, or I would have done it here because I've already done one at Aperture. They're kind of vanitas or vanity project. I give poetry readings. Sometimes there's not very many people there. So they're pictures that are kind of supposed to be about how great my audience is, and often it's quite small. So Kathy Ryan at the New York Times, who I've worked for before, the Times Magazine, called me in Italy and asked if I would come back to photograph on the Obama campaign. And she had an idea for the story that was called Obamanomics. The idea was to follow Obama around, photograph the audiences in the same way, his audiences in the same way as I had done, to kind of talk about the different aspects of his economic plan, that the audiences would be different depending on the different groups he talked to. So I did. Sorry. That's not one of his audiences. And it was an incredible, as all these guys know, logistical nightmare. I had to be in this privileged spot because I had to get into a spot that you can't really get into where the stage is. So I had to get, it's a long story, very complicated, very technical. The Obama machine is a machine. It works very efficiently and very well, and you can't push them in any way. As I was doing these pictures on this story, I really, really began to worry that it wasn't going to work to express this particular story. David, you didn't work on this, did you? No. Okay, good. Excellent, because I'm going to bash photo editors in a few minutes. I began to worry that these pictures weren't working, not because the pictures themselves weren't working, but because the audiences were kind of the same everywhere. And I couldn't get access to the private fundraisers and things. So I began to kind of leave the speech. I also made this portrait of him. I got access to make this portrait, which was really a fascinating experience. I could tell you more about later if you want. He has very warm hands. He's incredibly calm. It's almost like no one told him that he was running for president. They're like, you're doing a speech, a couple of speeches. It's nothing. It's nothing. It was weird how calm he was. I did not find him inspiring at all. I found him very workaday, workmanlike, getting through the day. He didn't have that sexual charisma that people say about Bill Clinton at all. I mean, everyone, right? You've met Bill Clinton. You want to sleep with him. Everyone does. People say that. At any rate, I had this idea, the stories about Obamonomics. I had read the story. I knew the basic kind of tenets of it. And so I thought, I'll take some time, even though I have to drive all the way across the entire state of Missouri to photograph another one of these audiences, I'll quickly try to go around and photograph things a la My Life in Politics that talk more about Obamonomics. And so, I went into this, in St. Petersburg, Florida, into this African-American barbershop, and found this amazing scene of this woman reading this. It's Florida, it's recession, and a wet wait to see Obama today. These pile of T-shirts. Someone today was asking, how many different Obama T-shirts have been made in the last 6 months? This is at the, what's it called? The Urban League conference in Orlando. It's Claire McCaskill. I love this correspondence between this Grateful Dead thing and the Obama thing. They're like the same logo, practically. So when I got back, I sent all the work in. I was really happy with the work I did. It was incredibly hard. And then I got called into the Times, and they said, well, these pictures aren't really working, the audiences. They're not diverse enough. And I said, yeah, but what about the pictures I did? And they said, well, we like that, and we like other pictures you've done. This is also from My Life in Politics. And what we want you to do is kind of recreate those pictures. We've made these props, and we want you to kind of recreate them. So I refused to do it, and got very upset. And they hired another photographer who very competently made cheap imitations of my work. There's my picture from My Life in Politics, Democrat and Republican stickers. There's the picture they ran. So my experience as an artist covering the campaign is that it was a failure, an utter failure. And don't do it, because photo editors, at least these people seem to want to publish what they had in their head before you got there. And if you're a photographer who deals with the outside world and your job is to interpret it in a complex, interesting way, you're not necessarily going to photograph what's in somebody's head who's sitting in an office in New York. So I think my project was my experience covering the campaign was an utter failure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Scull, a photo editor at the New York Times, but not the magazine. And we definitely took a different approach to the election this year. I think that brilliant political photography is interpretive, it's cerebral, it's metaphor, it's nuance, and to some degree, when it's done well, people will take different things away from it. Meaning you could look at a good political photograph on many different levels. So So this year, I was asked to do, about a year ago, I was asked to lead the way in our effort to cover the campaign. And this is not only my first time doing this, but this is really my first real job as a picture editor anywhere. I was a photographer until about 2 years ago. So I really had no idea how to do it, but I didn't tell them that. So I gathered a team, and we kind of made it up as we went along. And I was lucky enough to have Todd and Damon Winter, another New York Times photographer, who had never really covered a campaign either. So between us and Stephen Crowley, whose work you will also see tonight, and a number of other staffers and freelancers, we tried to take a little bit of a different approach to the campaign than I have seen in the past, and I think we were somewhat successful. The job of any political campaign is to feed their message to you. And television, by and large, I believe their mission is to be spoon-fed that image and deliver it to you, which is what they do very well. They set up their cameras and at events, and they're staged, and they point the camera in the direction they're supposed to. Not all the time, but most of the time. And I think that the still photographer's job is to work around the edges of that, and as much as they can to capture what's really going on, or to tell the story that we think is important to tell. And so that's how we approached it. And we did that through pictures of the candidates, but we also did that by photographing away from the candidates as much as we did the candidates themselves. And it was an interesting approach, and I think we came up with some very interesting interpretive images, none of which were preconceived by me. But I was always surprised by them, and it was brilliant. And I would give a little direction here and there, but by and large, the photographers ran with it. And it was a wonderful thing to see what was coming back and to see how each person saw it differently and interpreted it differently. And I think as a collection, they really do a really good job of telling the story, which is ultimately what I think is our mission, to tell the story for our readers and viewers who can't be there themselves. So I'm going to put Todd on and let him start talking about some of his pictures, and then we'll look at some of Damon Winter's and Steve Crowley's, and you could take away from it what you will.
Thank you. Yeah, and to kind of pick up where Dave left off as well, I mean, my job as the photographer on the ground, I think, is, and Tim touched on this as well, it's really hard to bring your own vision to this. And I'll get to that more of that later. But really, one of my main goals is try to, humanize the candidate, try to cut through the image and really try to show, try to find what they're all about, but also try to cut through all the madness, in this digital society. Now you have, everything's being recorded. There's more and more TV screens. There's more of everything. There's more wires. It's just, so, it's really to try to decide what to really keep out and clean up, but also what to keep in, because you never know what might be relevant, 6 months later, a year later, or like the Winogrand photo, 40 years later. And, we should also note too, like when you're on the ground, on the bus, you're working sometimes, 16, 18 hours a day. And so a lot of this is very visceral, and it's an editor's job back in New York to try to kind of disseminate that information and help make sense of it. And hopefully, I think, again, a year later or 6 months later, you can step back from these pictures and make sense of it. And even now, like just coming off the trail, less than a week ago, these all have a different meaning for me, and I think they will as we keep going on, especially with the Obama pictures. So we started this basically in Iowa, which was January or December of 2007, and Dave had put together this team, and gave each of us a candidate and said, we're going to pick one, you're going to lock on with them as long as they're in or until we move you around, and just stay with that guy, whoever. And so I put my money on Huckabee, and it was just a couple of us riding the bus. Actually, they didn't even have a bus in the beginning. We just followed them in our own cars, and when they got off, we would go off and go to whatever events they went to. And another photographer and I from the LA Times were kind of the only two covering him regularly, and he said, so Huckabee's going to go for a shave this afternoon. Don't tell anybody. We'll go cover this thing. So we get there early, get set up. We're like, great, we're going to get this really intimate moment with the barber, and 30 of our friends showed up. So, and this is like, this is pretty much the future. This kind of told me this is what you're in for. How do you make your own image? You can't do this every day. So how do you make your own image within that? And that's the challenge. So, what was great about a candidate like Huckabee, and especially being in Iowa, is that you can get really close to the candidates. He didn't have Secret Service, just a couple of staffers that you can talk to all the time. And, they have these great little photo ops. That's him in the yellow there. And and I was kind of learning this as I was going as well. So, we were just along for the ride and figuring this out as we went along. But he was a really fun candidate to cover, and I felt like, you were really, like I was saying, trying to get past the image and trying to find something real. These are where they're called OTRs, like off the record stops, where they don't put it on the schedule and they'll stop at a bakery and greet people, and this woman's telling them what to order at the bakery. And so it's difficult to try to find these little nuggets of what I think are, hopefully reality. These are just supporters on election night in Iowa. And also trying to figure out, trying to get to what the candidate is representing, what maybe you're not seeing. He's conservative minister, and we're obviously going to do stories about the religious aspects, but we're not seeing that. So we're always trying to, learn more and more about the candidate, either being on the ground or knowing who they are and trying to capture that in different ways. It's great too early on and with some of the smaller campaigns is that you can get backstage. A lot of the venues were just something like this, and you'd see them go in the back door, and then we would just maybe know the campaign manager and be like, can we go with you guys? Or just walk in, and they would either tell you to leave or just let you. Huckabee would either talk to you, and you'd be in, and maybe catch a real moment like this. And also too, trying to, get all the things off the candidate. We really worked hard and we were pushed by Dave and our editors a lot to just not just cover the candidate and do the obvious stuff, but really all the things that are around you. Because some of the most interesting stuff, like what you saw with Tim's work, is the stuff that isn't even near the candidate. And no people, just trying to tell this story, of all these candidates. This is right before one of the debates. So from there, they moved me on to Hillary Clinton, which is a completely different character from Mike Huckabee. Basically, she's running for president, but somebody who's already well known. She's already an icon, and she is surrounded by a Secret Service. So she's almost like covering the president, and it's really difficult to get to her logistically, and they're much more of a well-oiled machine. So it was much more challenging to cover that. But occasionally you find something kind of fun. This is in Las Vegas at one of the casinos. It's great. They're all wearing red. And what the great thing about all these is that the people, I think, are generally the most real part of it, and that's the best part of it. And another one, they go into the diner stop, similar to the Huckabee thing, but it takes a lot of time to try to get these. And I found Senator Clinton really interesting to cover because she just whatever they planned, she would do her own thing. And so it was challenging because you would go this way and she would go that way, or just, but occasionally she would stop and you would get this interaction. It's kind of a weird picture. They're throwing T-shirts to the crowd before she showed up. But. So I stuck with Hillary for a month or so in the primaries, and then went back for a week here, a week there. And this season was really grueling because it was like every primary was like a victory party or like a losing party onto the next one, and it was like election night over and over and over again. So once we got to like November 4th, everybody was just really jaded about it because you're like, oh, it's an election night, and it was pretty easy. But you would think this was the big night. We did, to go back to stuff like this, we had to take risks because we're going up against wire photographers who shoot every event somewhat the same way because they need a dateline from a different city. And, your editors can really make you compete against them. And what they did is they gave us a lot of rope to try to find a different angle or find a different way to capture something. So that we weren't doing what everybody else was doing, so that we had our own stuff. We were telling a different story. And, I had already covered the event from the ground and went up above, but, it's taking a risk, just completely taking yourself out of the mix, maybe missing a picture. And, to do the coverage I think that we did this year, you needed this freedom to really try to do it your own way and potentially fail, which I don't think we did very often. These are coming into the debates. And this, the way it was going to work out was, I was with Hillary, and then we had, a couple people with Hillary and a couple people with Obama, and, whoever won, then you were going to stick with them. And my candidates kept losing, so I bounced around a lot this year, which was also fun because, you had a lot of variety. And this as well, it goes back to trying to decide what part of the mechanics of the debate or the campaign to leave in and what to leave out. And the Times actually ran this on our front page that day, which I was really thrilled about because it's a quiet picture. They're actually listening to the moderator. They're not talking, but I think it captured something else that we hadn't done before. And we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, but we were just trying to step back more. The relationship with the media with the Clinton campaign was kind of humorous. It was playful at times, adversarial at times, but it was kind of an interesting aspect of this is in the press area. And Senator Clinton actually did come back to the plane a lot, almost every day, and talk to the media, where other candidates just completely shut down and would only talk maybe once or twice a week. But the media is such, and I'm talking about in general, is such a big part of the campaign now, and just how they end up treating all of us and how we're seen as part of that.
It becomes a big part of the story, so it's kind of hard to avoid it. And in a way, I think a lot of the photographers ended up using it in really interesting ways to sort of advance that, because it did become a big enough part of the story that in some ways it shaped, how the race went for some candidates.
And this is another press interview, but when you spend so much time with the candidates, you get to know them. You don't ever talk to them, rarely, and you don't really get to know them, but visually you get to know them, so you know what they do, say, when they're listening to a question, and so you're always looking for some, I never want to intentionally make anybody look bad, but I don't want to go out of my way to make them look slick either. But you're always looking for something a little different that you haven't seen before, like a different expression, again, like I said, to try to humanize. This is her concession speech in Washington, D.C. Then to just give you quickly, covering the conventions, back to that Winogrand photo, is probably the hardest thing, because there's just so much with the protests, with being on the convention floor. It's just absolute madness, the amount of imagery that you're inundated with. And so we tried to come up with some different ideas and images every day that tried to cut through that or say something about it. The protests were such a big part of it. And I think it's really important to try to get onto the streets. This is in Denver, to go into neighborhoods and go away from the convention floor to photograph real people. Like I said, we had done a number of different essays. One was about, at the Republican convention, about the imagery and patriotism and things like that, how you see more of this at one convention over another. And, trying to get into these parties, these parties are where you can get a lot more candor, and I think sometimes they can be hard to get into, but when you can, it gives you a really different side of it. Speaks for itself, I guess. This is actually before the convention. And Ron Paul had his own convention during the Republican convention in St. Paul. He had his own in Minneapolis at the Target Center, and this was before an interview. And just little surprises everywhere. This is a Phyllis Schlafly event where she was going to honor Sarah Palin, and Palin wasn't able to make it, so she introduced a special guest, and somebody from Code Pink got up there first and kind of sabotaged this event. And, people don't want you to show the reality, always show the reality of these events, but I feel like that's our job to really kind of call it how it happened. Drill, baby, drill. I'm not saying that, I'm saying that's what they were saying. So Palin came onto the scene, and I was lucky enough to cover her the last couple of days of the election. And I think part of it is because it's VPs, but also because this election had gone on so long that everybody was out of money. And so we still stuck with it. So we had somebody with McCain and Obama, but also Biden and Palin. And on this one, I had the luxury, the complete opposite of the Huckabee, I had the luxury of being the only photographer in the pool. So it was great. And they were actually pretty good at giving me access. There again, he kept talking about the disjointed limbs and everything. So they give you an idea too, like the mechanics of how this works. When you're on the plane, you go everywhere they do, and you'll sometimes do 6 events a day. And instead of covering every event the same, we try to get like the photos of the day, and also try to tell that story of the last days. And from there, I think that Monday we did 6 cities, and then flew an overnight trip to Wasilla, Alaska, and then got there. She voted, and we were there for about 2 hours. And we turned around and came back. So it was, and then it was election day. But this is actually in Wasilla at her favorite coffee shop. And I don't know if you can read it, but the headline says, "Board exonerates Palin." So it was showing that off. And it's a little easier for the stills because we can kind of be everywhere and move around. And the writers and TV people can get very frustrated because there were some events where they would only let stills in, like some of these stops, and they didn't want writers to ask questions. And this particular stop, somebody was able to get out a question. But it's just interesting how wherever you're going, you're being managed or manipulated in some way. And this is the second to last time that plane, what they do is when the campaign's over, they have the Secret Service detail, but if they lose the election, they take them home and they drop them off, and then that's it. So, and another thing that was great about the freedom we had covering this for the Times is, we were able to go for some more quiet images, not necessarily all the obvious pictures, but things like this where it's not like your, political moment that you see, but I think with the body language, I think it says so much more about how this relationship ended up. And this will go, we'll have David talk about this. This is Stephen Crowley's body of work about McCain, which he's been following since
The beginning.
the beginning, yeah. And
Since,
it followed him in 2000 as well.
Yeah, since September of '07, Steve Crowley was out with McCain, and this is just a perfect example of what the campaign doesn't want you to photograph. So McCain just had a note waiting for him when he got to his stool there, which it's just interesting. I mean, it's all so choreographed, and sometimes part of the story is showing that it's choreographed, if that's what you can get out of it. Okay, here's some folks down in South Carolina that were more interested in lunch than in McCain. And here's McCain getting magged. And this was when things weren't going as well for him, and they didn't really know where things were going to go. And this is just an interesting moment that Steve captured. This was again early on the bus, when he was meeting with the press, he was much more candid. And access is good then, early on, before you get too big or you have Secret Service protection. There's a lot more access, and I just think that's an interesting moment. Says something a little bit about McCain and his wife. Here's a couple of folks that don't like McCain or Rudy. And, here Steve just took a look at some stuff that was on the ground at a rally. It's what's left over.
You should also note, you'll see some more of these, but Stephen Crowley does these great diptychs and triptychs and, well, 4 pictures together.
Quadriptychs.
Quadriptychs. And you'll see a lot of these. So these are 4 different pictures put together, and they're really great.
So Steve is very interpretive. He saw this wire on the ground, and he thought it looked a little bit like a heartbeat. So this is when the McCain campaign wasn't doing very well. So there's a real visual metaphor there. And here's a diptych of him speaking in New York when things were better. And here's some views through a flag behind the stage. And so you have the cheerleaders, the honor guard, a supporter of McCain's, and then you have McCain himself down on the bottom. This is the night that he won New Hampshire. And here he is, somebody said, it wasn't how I coined it, but going to kiss the ring. So after he won the nomination. And this is, I think, a very interesting picture of McCain talking about the financial crisis. And on the right there you see Mark Salter, one of his advisors, who is in sunglasses. Here's a scene from the press portion of the bus, or of the plane, I mean.
And this is about the time too when McCain was always the Straight Talk Express, and always had reporters on, and was always coming out, and for a good chunk of time the curtain was closed and he wasn't talking to any of the media. So it's obviously somebody's statement on that.
And then Palin showed up on the scene, and this is a rally in Ohio. And it's a really interesting vignette. I love the way that you can't see McCain's face, and it's really become all about Palin now. And she was drawing big crowds. And then McCain during the economic crisis, decided to go to the Truman Library and make a speech on the economy, and for some reason decided to go to a cemetery right after that and see Truman's grave there. And here's Steve Schmidt, who masterminded everything for the McCain campaign. And here's Schmidt again with a couple other, Mark Salter and Charlie Black. And these are sort of behind-the-scene moments. They're not of the candidates, but they kind of show, what's going on. These guys are running a national campaign from their BlackBerries, in a parking lot, on a loading dock in a parking lot. And here's a very forced hug at the second presidential debate. And here's a McCain supporter that just doesn't like Obama. And you see photographers see a lot of arrivals and departures on the campaign trail. And this one strikes me, it's a little bit different. There's something about the bunting on the stairs and that just struck me as being just a little bit different. It's such a sort of a patriotic charade a lot of the times, They just try to dress it up as something that it's not. It's the candidate being told where to go. And here's a look at McCain at a luncheon, and then the press being fed their lunch down below. It's an interesting look, the same event. And here's a study of McCain's hands that Steve did, which I thought was really interesting. And they're always reaching. Photographers are always reaching at these events to do something different, to find a different way to tell the story or something about the candidate.
You think you should note too, these rallies after a while, they all look the same. This is really, they're kind of put on with the same, equipment or whatever, and so sometimes you forget where you are, and it can be really difficult to try to find something different, from all these rallies.
This is getting towards the end here. This is the McCain and his advisors getting on a plane, and one of his final TV appearances. Here's a little look behind the scenes at an event. Here's some of his advisors on election day, not looking very happy. And here's McCain on the plane, came out to basically announce that it was all over. And there's a relationship, the famous book, The Boys on the Bus, now it's The Boys on the Plane. But there's a relationship that happens, I think, between photographers and reporters and the candidate. And whether you like them or don't like them or whatever your personal feelings are, you're somewhat invested in the process. And this is him sharing the news with them. And here he is making his concession speech with Palin looking on. Okay, then we come to Damon Winter's work, and he had a really very different from Steve's and Todd's as well. I think all three of them had a different approach, but Damon took a very visual approach to the thing, and just in a beautiful way, just captured the campaign trail in a way that I haven't seen before. And he spent a lot of time with Obama. Early on, he did a little photo essay on security, and we decided to take a look at Secret Service protection, which he was given much earlier than any of the other candidates because of some threats. And here's a whole mob of candidates. I'm sorry, of Secret Service with Obama. And everybody gets magged at these things. You never know what you might have in her ladybug boots there. And Secret Service is very vigilant, and they make it difficult to take pictures, as Tim was saying earlier. But it's an incredible job, incredible responsibility that they have. These are a series of diptychs that Damon put together, inspired by Steve's diptychs, of some of the scenes that he saw out on the trail, and they're just some really interesting pairings. I particularly like this one. That's the Democratic and Republican conventions. And then he was briefly out, I think, for a week or so with John Edwards, and the Edwards campaign wasn't happy with him because he was shooting what he saw instead of what they wanted him to see, and they claimed that he was making Edwards look like he was alone in dark places. I don't know why they thought that. And the Hillary campaign didn't like him either. She made him look small. He made her look small, and this is just a great shot of the shadow of the plane on, I guess that's a parking lot. And then he was out with Obama for a good part of the year. And there was a lot to photograph there, a lot of reaction. Obama was very, from what Damon said, very easy to photograph, especially on stage. Very quiet behind the scenes, but on stage he had a lot of looks. This was a scene at a shift change at a plant in Ohio, I think, and this gentleman came out and grabbed Obama's hand and held it up like he was a boxer. The next president of the United States. It's a nice moment. This was during, I guess, a commercial break with Chris Matthews. They didn't have that much to talk about. This is a wonderful image, I think, taken in Denver during the Democratic convention. And he was out looking for imagery and icons, and he found this shirt seller, and then a truck drove by with Obama's image on, Osama's image on it. So you have Obama, Osama. And you know, a lot of Republicans, a lot of people tried to make that connection, and to actually see it present itself like that in the real world, I just thought was fascinating. And here Damon saw speaks for itself. Here's that call-in center that Obama went to. And bowling not so well. Somebody noted today that his toe is over the line there. What did he bowl, a 65 or something?
I think it was even lower.
Even lower. And the candidate is, you know, they're always managed. It's all these events are orchestrated, and it's just a good example of that. Here, people were asked on the tax issue how many people make over 100 or under $100,000, and everyone raised their hands. They wanted everyone to vote. I just think that's a really powerful image. Here's a great, just a great example of looking away from the candidate and what do you say? You know, here's a wonderful moment that wasn't orchestrated that just shows the joy of this kid. And another one, expectations. Young, vibrant candidate. We know that because we did a sort of a post-mortem on the election and one of our reporters got that.
Or McCain cancel a rally because of rain?
Yeah. Again, I think you see, you know, the reality in the crowd, you know, is there are more real moments there, and that's what Damon was looking at. Here's that same image again. And the behind-the-scenes access, it's quite limited, and I think I would say every 4 years it becomes less and less available to photographers. It becomes very, very difficult, especially later on. Obama did allow us a little bit, and some photographers were given more, but it becomes rarer and rarer because they want to control everything. Here's some kids from a school watching an Obama event through a fence. Election night. It's the emotion. That's it.
Originally, we had planned to continue the discussion among ourselves, and we can certainly do that. But I'd like to open the session to give you an opportunity to ask any questions you might have. If you'd like to do so, please come to the microphones that are on the end of either aisle. I think someone's coming. If not, I have questions I can ask. But we've seen a great deal tonight. Obviously, we see far, far more than the presidential candidates. Right? You see the entire process, the theatrical process of the American presidential campaign, and you see much of America beyond that as well. So this is wonderful, wonderful work. I would like to ask the pros here a question or two to get things going. One is, what has changed in particular? I mean, was there a different vibe this time than before? Is there a different relationship between the candidates and the press? Is there a different sense that that the photographic work itself is doing different work in respect to everything else that's in the press, in respect to the print journalists, for example, anything like that? What in particular seems to be particularly distinctive about photojournalism in this presidential election?
Well, Dave should talk about this too, from seeing it both sides, but having not done too much of it, I can just give you my impressions of this year and things that I've heard. And, you know, I think one thing is that there's kind of a contradiction, because while they're really controlling of the image and you know, I've literally heard campaigns say, well, we're trying to protect the candidate. And I think, you know, if you look at those Obama pictures, what are you trying to protect the candidate from, you know? So in some respect, they know the power of it, but in a lot of ways that I noticed on another campaign is that really overlook the power of photojournalism and not letting somebody like David Burnett. I don't know if you know David Burnett. He's been around a while, and he's taken some very iconic political portraits, and one candidate would not let him do a beautiful 4x5 portrait, and I feel like they were missing out by not doing that. I think another thing that's driving that, and I don't know how recently this has really started, but the candidates are being watched constantly now, and you have the networks have what are called embeds, and they're people who videotape every time you see the candidate. They videotape every speech, and it's basically just to have a record that they can go back to, to hold them accountable for everything they say, but also to record the gaffes. There was one of Hillary where the flags fell down behind her, and it got I don't know how many hits on the internet. So the campaign is very skittish about having everything documented, and you as a still photographer are just pushed in with that whole group, and I don't think they really make a distinction of what they can get out of the still photographs.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that this year there was an immediacy to the process. You saw the pictures faster; they were online quicker, and I think that maybe it lends a certain sense of almost paranoia to the campaigns. They really don't want you to shoot anything that they don't want to see, that they haven't orchestrated, and in some cases, I think it didn't really work for them. I think in the case of Hillary Clinton, she kept photographers at a distance. They didn't allow anything behind the scenes. And I think visually, you ended up with a sense of somebody who was, sort of aloof and unapproachable and hard. The Obama people allowed, at least earlier on, let cameras in much closer, let the photographers closer. And it imparted a sense of being closer to the candidate and someone who's open and wants to be part of the process. So it cuts both ways. It cuts both ways between them trying to control things, but then not necessarily getting the image across that they want. So. In that sense, I think that was the biggest difference that I saw.
As their comments suggested, campaign managers are of necessity. Oh, do we have a question? Oh, terrific. Great.
It seemed like the job that the photojournalists used to be there to do is now being done by the throngs of people holding up the cameras, taking the kind of orchestrated image. And so it seems like the photojournalists are doing work more like what Tim was doing, or more like the ones we saw from the earlier campaigns that used to be the purview of the artists. So I'm wondering if Tim has, like a sense of intuition of where you're going to go next, or if you've seen other artists who have already kind of figured out with the vanguard, like what's the next step away as the photojournalists kind of take over your territory?
I don't think they're taking it over. I think I just made a very brief furtive foray into theirs, and it was a little bit like, walking into a candy shop with enormous wedding cake and kind of going like, I would push this around and see how it kind of works. But I just being here tonight and watching these pictures, it's exhausting, and it's just reminding me how horrific and exhausting this campaign was. I'm really miserable, and I just can't even imagine. I was there for 5 days, and I was ready. I needed like a month recuperation, and it's really, it just makes me, those moments of your pictures and all the pictures we looked at in your presentation about when they went away from the event. It's so much more, and maybe that's just a way of answering this in a way, was that all of this stuff, what's kind of wonderful about this moment right now is the feeling that it's, you know, it's lingering on, it's leaking on. I took out a bunch of pictures out of my presentation of Paul Fusco's RFK Funeral Train, which, if you haven't seen that book, and there's a new book, I guess, an expanded version of it, who photographed on the train carrying Robert Kennedy's body from New York to Washington, or Arlington, and photographed people lining the tracks, kind of waving and watching this go by. And it was a brilliant move, and in a way, you know, the pictures weren't published at the time, right? They weren't the news. And they're like this national reaction shot of this event on the public psyche. And I always, when the book came out, I was like, this is the last moment when anyone in America really believed in a politician. Like, this was it. And maybe I'm just saying that from the point of view of the left, but because maybe people really believed in Ronald Reagan, but I just can't believe that's really true. Anyway, and now it feels like there's something else, that there is this little, all that sloganeering and all that stuff, feels like there's this little residual kind of like hopelet that we have with us in our little pocket. And it just makes me feel like, oh God, maybe next time there won't be a political campaign, or it'll be like, you know, they'll declare it 2 weeks in advance like they do in Italy, and it's just boom and it's over. And because it's kind of like saying, like, all of you that had an entire day today and saw all kinds of things and had all kinds of interactions, and then to say, okay, what would it be like to photograph this event right now? Because this event is a little bit like what the campaign is like. Except for none of us are as cute as Obama. But, you know, it would be problematic. This thing is staged, very carefully stage managed for your viewing pleasure. And, you know, I guess my hope, for my own work, it's like I made political work in Italy, but it was very different. And I just don't think I could ever manage to approach this. And my own practice in this thing was, I didn't allow myself any special access. I didn't mention that before, but I only went to places I could just walk into as a person carrying an enormous camera. And I imagine that those places are diminishing and shrinking in number every second.
It's funny that you mentioned other people's cameras and all the technology, and you brought this up as well. And you know, and sometimes in certain campaigns, the average person with a camera can get better access than we can, and it can be a little frustrating because, you know, you can't just wander into the crowd. You're being pushed into some sort of corral here and there, and so when I was working the Hillary campaign, I had this idea where I was giving out my card to everybody in the crowd to ask them to email me their pictures because I wanted to see what they looked like. Nobody emailed me back, but there will be more campaigns and, you know, even better cameras, you know, in 2012. So, you know, I can do it again. But I was watching a guy with an iPhone, and I was looking at his pictures, and I couldn't really get to where he was. And he was getting these amazing pictures. You know, he was like a foot away, and it was with this iPhone. And I wanted to see him, but
There's an artist named Rob Pruitt who has a show right now. Maybe it might still be up of iPhone, his own iPhone pictures.
If you have a question, just come down, because I can't necessarily see your hand in the glare here. But, I'll ask another. I really liked your comment that for the most part we aren't explicitly, certainly passionately political in our daily lives. Whereas, of course, the insiders in the campaign live nothing else, and so there's this massive disconnect there. But somehow we're brought together in the campaign, and what interested me is that on the one hand, we're seeing these candidates over and over and over again, and the photographers are being pushed to find ever more distinctive angles to show us the same thing. But what so many of these beautiful images showed us was America. That is to say, not the same candidates, but lots of people we wouldn't necessarily see in the photographic frame. Old folks eating their macaroni and cheese and in the old folks' home and so forth. And so I wonder, particularly when you're on the road, Is there a story there that you're trying to tell, or that otherwise is not being told, except by accident during these electoral campaigns?
Well, I think that's why people with snapshot cameras aren't going to replace photojournalists, because they don't bring that perspective with them. And they're not really, I mean, some are storytellers, and there are good photographers everywhere, but trained photojournalists, you know, have a perspective or telling a story. And I think, I'm hoping that tradition will never end, no matter how many people have iPhones or other kinds of cameras. It's just a different process. They both have value, but they're very different.
Well, I think that's certainly the challenge of being on the bus, we'll call it, you know, we were all photographing out the window and trying to say something about where we were. Like any event we had, you know, we wanted to give a sense of place and who the people are. And when you're on the bus, it can be really challenging to really, it's a blur, and to really slow down and try to at least capture something of who's there, who shows up, and you know, and really get at who they are, because it's such an important part of the process. You know, it's a little easier to do when you're maybe in Iowa before you're, you know, in this, you're traveling around the state, and you know, you can, you know, stop a little bit more. But I think that's the goal, and I hope we don't stop it.
I can't get over I'll never forget this feeling, because I literally came back from a year of living in Italy and went immediately to Springfield, Missouri. And it was like the most exotic, fantastic, wonderful place. And the last thing I wanted to do was go to a political rally. Like, I was so entranced with everything. And I'll never forget, we had to drive, because we couldn't be on the bus, because we had to get there in advance to get into this inner area and set up. And it was a weird calculus of, like, there had to be audience members in the audience, but the candidate couldn't be there, so it was like really complicated. So I'm driving all the way across Missouri as fast as I possibly can with an assistant, and we see on the other side of the highway, in the middle of a field, a giant sign, incredibly beautifully painted, hand-painted, fantastic, in this gorgeous farmscape that just says, "Americans Against Obama." Just like fantastic, and like, we're going, oh God, we're late, we got to get to this thing, and I'm just like, I said, fuck it, and I'm just like, you know, got off, turned around, we're driving down bumpy roads trying to find it, and we can't find it, hysterical, and then finally it's like, whoa, there it is, and I just thought, you know, like, oh God, you know, the pressure of these events is so, the orchestration of these events is so uninteresting, really. It's kind of like what we have to work against, whereas, you know, the ways that these things have kind of proliferated into the landscape and into the American people are it's so magical and endless, and, you know, people are so, it's kind of like creativity, this weird thing where people do all these, you know, this guy made this 30-foot high sign and nailed it to his tree, and beautiful colors, you know, it was fantastic, and all this creativity of the American people that, you know, is kind of like squashed by our sort of daily lives, going to Applebee's and Walmart. So it's tough. I think it's really tough. Next time, I really think they should just, it's 2 weeks, the campaign, it's over.
I agree.
And I think it's already, the next one's already started, if you saw Palin out there this week.
Okay.
For either of the photographers, did you find that your own political views ever got in the way, where you were having shot on both sides, that you ever felt like you were leaning towards skewing an image based on your own feelings? Was that something you had to kind of work on?
I think just by the nature of what we do, it's a bigger issue for me. I mean, do you want to answer that first, and I can?
Well, my thing was just about, I was confronted by this portrait, and here I am with this guy, and I'm completely fascinated with him, and there's only one handler there in the room, and just me and him, and I could have really done anything, and I had 10 minutes, I had a 4x5 view camera and no lighting equipment, and I had to do all this calculus that occurs when anyone takes a picture of anything, just so much of what makes a photograph, like once I'm in front of the thing, what the hell do I do? And, you know, I just was like, the instinct to make a good picture completely took over the thing that I was like, I love this guy, I want this guy to win, please. You know, I don't know if you've had this conversation, but I've had this conversation a few times, like, what part of your body would you chop off in order to secure an Obama victory? Like, I had this conversation. You know, and it really some people really went with it. But the instinct to make a good picture and a compelling picture really took over, and it was kind of like totally instinctual. I got to make the best possible picture I can make of this situation, and I'm really happy with the picture. I'm sure that they don't like it. He looks really exhausted and tired and beat, and you know, it was the only picture of mine that ran in the story, so I was happy about that.
You know, it's impossible to, you know, I mean, I'm a human being. I have views, so I have opinions about, you know, how I feel. But, you know, I have to be very careful to not let that show. And, you know, working for the Times, who were already, you know, taking a lot of criticism from certain campaigns, you know, you really have to be careful. And you know, it's a lot like what Tim says too. You know, I really focus on, you know, the mechanics of it and the, you know, trying to make a good picture regardless of who they are. And I really, you know, find myself tuning out what they're saying so that I can just really focus on trying to get at who that candidate is. I forget what else I was going to say about that. But, you know, I mean, that's the challenge because, you know, as a photojournalist, you know, you like to say that you're completely objective, but no photojournalist can be completely objective. But you know, I can't really let, you know, my internal politics get in the way of it.
Yeah, and certainly at the Times, and I guess all newspapers, we expect photographers to be objective, but it's as Todd said, it's not possible to be entirely objective. We're all human beings, but I think really it's in the editing process that you really have to catch what you're seeing and what you're showing. I mean, I could look at 300 pictures from an event, and it doesn't matter who the photographer was. I could choose pictures that say 10 different things about the candidate. Them looking sad, them looking happy, them looking strong, weak, you know, you name it. So ultimately, it's the pictures that are published or that go up on the web or shown somewhere. You know, that's the acid test. That's, I think, where you have to make hard decisions about, you know, what are you going to present? Because, of course, any photographer can skew things, but I think it's the editor's job, you know, whether the skewing is intentional or not, it's the editor's job to try to be fair. And that was the challenge for me and the other editors for the whole year, because the campaigns were watching, the readers were watching, and, you know, we got a lot of emails that I had to sometimes defend my choices, and it wasn't always easy.
I'll tell you one other thing, was that when I sat down with Obama, he said, so, you know, how do you want me to look? Happy or solemn? And I said, well, the article is about the economy. He said, okay, solemn. So he is kind of funny, actually.
Well, too, you know, the thing that I had to come to terms with a little bit, too, is like, generally what I do is like, you know, I do feature stories on you know, regular people, and where you develop a relationship with them, and the great pictures come from these relationships and the sympathy that I have, you know, to the subject. And you know, I think in politics, you know, you can start to become, I'll just say, sympathetic, you know, as a general term. And you know, you have to be very careful with that too, because I don't care who the candidate is, whether you're for them or against them, their campaign is trying to manipulate you in some way. And so that alone really kind of makes you step back a little bit. And you know, if it wasn't just about me, then that certainly is another layer, you know, paired with editing, that hopefully brings a little more objectivity.
We're getting near the end of our time together, but we have 2 questions for sure. So you were first.
I just wanted to kind of give a comment, and thank you, all you speakers up there. I thought you did a great job and picked some great images. One of the things that I wanted to say was that I watched when Obama gave the winning speech, and I saw that on the television, and the next day I looked in the newspaper and I saw, I believe it was the New York Times if I'm not mistaken, a bulletproof glass, like a foot of it next to him. That didn't really show up. I didn't see it so much when I watched it live on the video, but when I saw the photograph, I said, wow, there's really a story right in that photo that really wasn't presented live during the presentation. So I just thought that was a real striking moment of the power of photography over sort of the moving medium of video.
Yeah, thank you. We actually made it an intentional decision to run an image that showed the bulletproof glass because I thought it said something about some of the things that Obama's going to have to contend with, you know, as our first African-American president.
My question is, how did the photographs work in conjunction with the text? I mean, do they precede the text, or do they work in conjunction with the text? Or I'm just curious to know how, you know, the dynamic between the image and the article.
Maybe a question for you.
What text?
Yeah.
Well, it's always negotiation. A lot of it comes down to just how much text there is, to be honest with you. I mean, there's a process at least at the paper that, believe it or not, it's really a nuts and bolts kind of thing. In the morning, the section asks for space, and they're allotted a certain amount of space. Well, if the writing side decides to write more words, then there's less space for pictures sometimes. But they try to keep, you know, a certain amount of percentage of space available. And the New York Times has made a real commitment to, you know, running good photography. But it's a negotiation between the photo editor and the designer and the page editor, and there's a whole group of people, not just me or another picture editor, that makes that happen. Oftentimes it's a matter of having a number of people agree that a picture is a really great picture and it should run 5 columns. And sometimes they have to eat up space because they don't have enough words, and they're trying to make you run a mediocre picture bigger than it should. So it's somewhat of a practical process.
I believe he was next, and then you're after him. And I just make a brief comment, and that's on the production side. There's another set of answers on the reception side, which is sometimes you will look at the picture merely as an illustration of the text. And sometimes you'll look at the picture as the primary object of your consciousness, but the text can still inflect it, can still shift the meaning considerably. And sometimes they break away from one another. And either the text or the image is reproduced down the line and without any direct correspondence anymore. And so, you know, it depends on what people are doing with the image as well, as an individual viewer or reader, and also in terms of the process of circulation and reappropriation and things like that. So, in fact, a lot of different things can happen. There's not necessarily one fixed relationship that's determined by the producer.
Yeah, and we certainly always hope that the picture will advance the story in some way that the words did not or could not. And, you know, that's, of course, is the real power of photography.
Yeah, I think it's hard to find something to photograph in the place. Think about how hard it is to find something to write about.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in how digital has changed your approach to a story. For example, my dad shot speed graphic, 4x5 news, and then 35 mil comes along and one roll is sufficient to gather a story or hopefully at a certain point. And now you have a memory card that can hold hundreds of photographs. Does that change your approach?
Well, in a couple of, I mean, one way, just purely logistically, it's made our lives harder because, you know, every time an event's done, you know, we talk about those bad days where it's like 5 different cities. Every event that's done, I have to go download all those pictures onto my computer, keep track of where the heck I was, and try to get those out because of the internet. They want they want pictures as quickly as possible. And, I have to store that somewhere. I have to have battery power. I have to have all this stuff to go with me so that I can always transmit my pictures wherever I go. I mean, I think it's helped a little bit because I can shoot as much as I want, which is not always a better thing. That's just because you shoot more doesn't mean your pictures are better. But I found that digital cameras, you can sketch more, and I find that works for me. Some older photographers think that if you look at the back of the screen after you shoot a picture, that you're just like a complete Neanderthal. So it's a different philosophy.
Tell them what they call it.
They call it chimping because when you see it, you go ooh 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 and look at the back of the camera.
That's the line for the night.
I have a comment and a question. Interesting, as a documentary filmmaker and a photographer, I'm listening to this evening, and you're starting, and it's just in awe about the documentary process of just looking at your experiences as to what it's like to be behind the scenes, the control, the dynamics, the arrows that tell you everything. I have never had that idea. Just being exposed to that is very insightful, and I think this would be interesting to show to other people what it's like being behind the scenes, especially his commentary about hating it with a passion, and some of the discovery of the photographs that you guys showed, just amazing, especially the little boy and the people stories. So my question is to the editor, how do you approach this in your own mind, and what do you think the future of audio will be as we move forward from moving images and still images having the ability for the picture actually to get the sounds of, like when he was shaving, you could hear the sounds of the shaving, you could click on something. I've been playing with the concept of sound photo portraits, and I'm just wondering what.
It would have been hard to hear the sound of the shaving with the 500 cameras going off.
Everything you hear would be shutter clicks.
But I'm just wondering, how are you looking at that in the future?
Well, sound is interesting, and a lot more of our photographers are collecting sound. More and more, I was just involved in helping photo edit a multimedia piece that we did on the campaign, and so then you're marrying still images with narration and other sound. And it's really rich. I mean, I'm really excited by it. And I didn't think that I would be necessarily, because I felt like, oh, great, the audio or the sound is going to constrain me and as to what images I can use or how they would be sequenced. But I felt like, or I feel like the end result is really powerful. And, I would encourage anyone to do it. And I know we're going to be doing more of it. And it's a brave new world.
This will be the last question.
Excuse me, I just would really love to hear any of your comments on the New York Times Yes Men intervention today.
What's that?
You guys don't know about this?
What is this?
You don't know about it? Was even somebody referred to it earlier today.
Oh, to the
New York Times,
fake newspaper?
The fake newspaper, but it's more than just The Onion. It's an artist group, and
we saw this.
I haven't. When
we were walking out the door.
I saw it, but I haven't read it.
Same thing.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's who it is. Okay.
The reason that I bring it up too is because being that it was the Yes Men, it's much more of they're artists as opposed to, and they're conceptual, their performance, their all of this put together, as opposed to it necessarily just being like a fake newspaper like The Onion. Right. It's a different thing, and I actually find that there's something very relevant in the changes that we saw in digital media and this approach of theirs and how they did this, and how they put this together. I don't know exactly how they orchestrated it. Perhaps people here know more so, because I heard they were handing them out today. But just in terms of if you feel that there's any relationship with the freedoms that you were given and a new sense of freedom that I think people have found utilizing New York Times, but if there's any comment.
I don't really know enough about it to comment. I'm sorry. I think it's interesting. I mean, and but I'd have to have a chance to read it.
Yeah, we actually saw this when we were coming here. Our editor had a copy of this on her desk, and we were looking at this. And I mean, I'm not speaking for the New York Times, but I know lots of people were really intrigued by the whole thing. I didn't see much negativity towards it. But
And just as a follow-up to that, I think it's interesting actually that you just heard about it from your editor in the afternoon, and I heard about it through a listserv. I study art history at the Graduate Center, and so it's the Graduate Center's art history listserv that sent this out immediately as soon as it was found out. Look at what the Yes Men did, and it's a big deal. So I just thought that it would be interesting.
I will make a comment, even though I haven't read it, which is, to put the point bluntly, if all we had were the New York Times, we'd be in big trouble. Okay, and much as I love that newspaper, we need not only serious journalism, but we need all the parodic work, all of the artistic work, that the public culture depends upon a multitude of voices, a multitude of media, and the continual interaction among them. And so work such as this is just yet another example. And it's not a question of one replacing the other so much as our being able to make the most of all of these resources. And speaking of resources, I would like to thank the Aperture Foundation for making this evening possible. And could we please give a hand, and to the fine panelists that thank you very much.